Well, welcome everybody. I am just going to wait. Hey, Steve. I'm going to wait just a second to make sure we get everybody on, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I know it was a little bit of a change to move this program to a weeknight. We're trying to accommodate everyone's schedules and whatnot. I'm Karen Jones. I am the Teamsters historian, and I am very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight. Some of you may have heard him before. It's Dr. Eric Arnesen, who is the Teamsters Modern Labor History Professor at George Washington University. It's part of the endowment that we gave to the university. He always presents very interesting programs for us, and he's learning to become a Teamster, which is different than academia, I must say, but he's coping really well with that. So what we're going to do is have him give his presentation like usual. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, but also we are going to have time at the end to answer any questions that come up. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just give me one moment to do this. And can everyone see what I've got in front of me?
Yes.
Terrific. Thanks, Karen, and thank you everyone who is joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure to work with the Teamsters Human Rights and Diversity Commission. I am thrilled, as always, to be here. So my title, my assignment this evening, Forgotten Histories, the Many Civil Rights Movements of the 20th Century. Maybe this is a title that makes sense to you. Maybe it's a title that needs some explanation. So I've posed the questions in a straightforward way. Why this particular title? Why this particular subject? Because I haven't actually given a talk with this title organized in this way before. But the answer to these questions comes from a quirk of television scheduling, if you will. And tomorrow evening, in case anyone is interested, is a new PBS program produced by the American Experience on the most famous activist you've probably never heard of. On the advertisement, there is a subtitle, A Civil Rights Hero No Longer Forgotten. And the American Experience has produced over the decades some magnificent documentaries. And anybody who teaches American history knows that these are really very good resources for the classroom. And it's one of the ways that at least a small number of Americans get their history across the country. In this instance, the subject matter is an individual by the name of Walter White, not the one that most people have heard of from different more recent programming, but the historical figure of Walter White, who was an activist who worked from the 1910s to the 1950s, the early 1950s. He crusaded against the extra-legal, brutal practice of lynching. He fought against the poll tax, restricting African Americans and some poor whites from voting. He campaigned relentlessly against racial segregation. He protested discrimination in the job market. When African American soldiers during World War II were being subjected to unfair, racist abuse and treatment, Walter White was there to defend them. He did these things and much, much more. So his contributions to the history of 20th century civil rights are absolutely substantial. And he was, for decades before the emergence of the modern civil rights movement, at the center of civil rights politics. So Walter White is a name that is quite familiar to historians, at least people working in 20th century African American or civil rights history, but perhaps not so much to the larger public. Hence, he's the most famous activist you've probably never heard of. But if you watch this documentary, he'll be a civil rights hero no longer forgotten. Or at least we hope that many people watch it will recognize the name and the contribution. But although individuals and individual activists are undoubtedly important, nobody can question that assertion, it's worth remembering that the work that they do often comes from their participation in organizations, that their accomplishments are made possible by drawing upon the resources of networks of equally committed people. This was certainly true in the case of Walter White. The organization that he was part of, that was his institutional home for many decades, through which he labored year after year, was the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the one civil rights organization that folks even today, might have heard of. And in thinking about building on tomorrow's episode, which I have not seen since it's not out yet, but I will be sure to tune in thinking about that episode and its framing and the language that it used, I could have gone in any number of directions. And one of the directions would have been the institutional one, to focus on the many, many civil rights organizations that dotted the political landscape of the 20th century, that paved the way for the success of the modern civil rights movement, that burst onto the scene in the mid-1950s, and that scored, after much effort, many setbacks, and considerable sacrifice, the landmark civil rights victories of the 1960s. Or I could have started a little bit further back in time, in the late mid-19th century, and talked about an organization that was featured in my first paper in graduate school, in this research paper, in the spring of 1981. So that's like 45 years ago. I first encountered the Colored National Labor Union, a group that I suspect that almost no Americans outside the academy and a small number in the labor movement have ever heard of. This was a group that represented former slaves and former free people of color in the labor realm, insisting upon a place for Black workers in the American economy and in the labor movement. Jumping ahead in time, I could have looked at, say, the 1930s and talked about the National Negro Congress. In the midst of the Great Depression of the 1930s, a new organization emerged, the NNC, the National Negro Congress. It was a left-oriented, left-led protest group that found the workings of the NAACP too cautious, too staid, and it pioneered a louder, more aggressive form of protest politics. Or I could have focused on the March on Washington movement of the World War II years. That movement focused on the widespread employment discrimination in defense industries, as well as the segregation of African Americans in the armed forces. It was a group that filled stadiums and union halls and churches during the Second World War. It captured headlines, prompting the Roosevelt administration to issue an Executive Order 8801 to stop 8802 to stop ostensibly stop segregation in defense industries. Or I could have gone into the 1950s and looked in detail at the Montgomery Improvement Association, a local organization that just appeared in late 1955 when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus, an organization that conducted a year-long boycott of the city's segregated bus system, catapulting a young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. into the national spotlight. Or I could have looked at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a group composed primarily of African American ministers that was founded by Dr. King in 1957 to build upon the work of the Montgomery bus boycott. It engaged in voter registration work. It organized numerous demonstrations and pickets and protests. It was a key vehicle for spreading the idea of nonviolence to African Americans and their allies in the late 1950s and 1960s. Or you could take the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an interracial but largely African American alternative to the lily white Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party sought to carry out unofficial parallel elections to demonstrate Black interest in the franchise. They sought to displace the lily white Democratic Party delegation at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. Or I could have talked about the Congress of Racial Equality, initially a small interracial organization founded in Chicago in the early 1940s, a group that used nonviolence and nonviolent protest in the cause of integration, and which initiated the Freedom Rides to desegregate Southern transportation in 1961. Or look at the National Council of Negro Women, a quote unquote organization of organizations founded in 1936, dedicated to advancing African American women's participation in political and civil life and working with other civil rights organizations in broad coalitions. Or look at the National Urban League, a group founded in 1910, largely as a social service agency. It became, over the years, deeply involved in promoting Black economic advancement, which required it to target employment discrimination and become more activist in orientation. Or you could take the Black Panther Party, which was founded in the Bay Area in 1966. Though I probably wouldn't go down that path. I wouldn't classify the Black Panther Party as a civil rights organization, given its espousal of Black power, its embrace of certain Marxist tenets that put it in a somewhat different category than other civil rights organizations. But it was a very real presence on the local and national scene in the late 1960s, attracting not just media attention, but considerable police repression as well. I could have done these things. And maybe in a different talk, I will actually pause and explore these organizations in more detail. But tonight, I want to return to the question of forgotten activists, activists that you probably never heard of, or maybe this being a activist union, you have heard of some of them, but I want to look at forgotten heroes as well as forgotten histories. And I will say at the outset that there are many, many forgotten histories and many, many forgotten heroes. And to the extent that folks remember anything about the civil rights movement, it's usually the name Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that comes to mind. It's almost as if, as important as he is, he takes up all the oxygen out of the historical room. And that's the one name that people can remember. Ask them to identify other activists who were present, say, at the March on Washington in 1963. I suspect most people posed that question will draw a blank. Thinking about other civil rights figures, maybe they can recall the name of Rosa Parks, but that's probably about it. And that's very unfortunate, for the civil rights movement was about far more than Dr. King or Rosa Parks. The history is far richer and far more complicated. But now that I think about it, there is another name that many Americans, if pressed, might remember, the escaped slave turned abolitionist, turned civil rights leader, turned Republican Party leader, Frederick Douglass. His autobiography is occasionally read in classrooms across the country, or at least it used to be, and he got not one but several postage stamps by the U.S. Postal Service commemorating him. Indeed, Frederick Douglass is even recognized by presidents of the United States. And in 2017, during the first Trump administration, the now current president then recognized the life of Frederick Douglass, the, quote, former slave who became an outstanding orator and leader of the abolitionist movement, unquote, or at least that's how the official statement read. Frederick Douglass is an example of somebody who's done an amazing job and is getting recognized more and more, I notice, the president remarked in his public address. And as various commentators have put it, his remarks were, quote, widely scrutinized, with reports questioning whether Trump realized that Douglass was no longer alive. Now, at least Douglass is getting some more attention. I guess that's a good thing, even if some can't quite place him in the right century or to acknowledge whether he's alive or long since passed. But if Americans don't know much about African American history and they know little about civil rights history, things seem to be going from bad to worse. And it's likely that they will know even less in the future than what little they know now. You can take the example of our Secretary of Education nominee, Linda McMahon. At her confirmation hearing before the Senate Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy asked her about, quote, educational programming centered around specific ethnic and racial experiences. My son is in a public school, he said. He takes a class called African American History. If you are running an African American history class, could you perhaps be in violation of this executive order? McMahon responds, I'm not quite certain. I'd like to look into it further and get back to you on that. Murphy. So there's a possibility. There's a possibility you're saying that public schools that run African American history classes, right? This is a class that has been taught in public schools for decades. It could lose federal funding if they continue to teach African American history. McMahon, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I'd like to take a look at these programs and understand fully the breadth of the executive order and get back to you on that, unquote. Have to get back to you on that. The nominee could not flat out say that African American history classes could be taught in public schools without violating President Trump's anti-DEI order. So here we are in Black History Month, and we don't really know what the status of Black history will be in the near or the long term. As an Associated Press story put it very, very recently, in the wake of this executive order against DEI, the Defense Department issued guidance declaring, quote, Identity Months dead, and said that working hours would no longer be used to mark cultural awareness months such as Black History Month, Women's History Month, and National Disability Employment Awareness Month, end quote. The Department of Defense, at least temporarily, took down training videos about the Tuskegee Airmen, believing that the inclusion of these videos were in violation of Trump's executive order about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Well, this caused something of an uproar. The Tuskegee Airmen are something of a established tradition, institution here. And even Republicans complained about the removal of this material. Alabama's congressional delegation voiced objections, a report noted. And as someone said, the Air Force removing the Tuskegee Airmen from training videos is pathetic, disgraceful, and disrespectful. End of quote. The videos were put back up shortly thereafter. But I just noted shortly before this webinar, looking at the Washington Post's online headlines, there's this one that appears, and this might be in tomorrow's paper. Large Trump guidance on race has schools scrambling, admit intense fear. We'll see where that goes. So for the moment, the Tuskegee Airmen are safe, or rather their history will not be airbrushed out of the picture, and we can take some comfort that President Trump is still acknowledging Black History Month, even if many of his cabinet departments are not. And the president just hosted a number of weeks ago a reception at the White House acknowledging Black History Month. Today, he said, we pay tribute to the generations of Black legends, champions, warriors, and patriots who helped drive our country forward to greatness. And these are really great, great people, Trump said. Well, these are encouraging words, I suppose. The president continued. He has his own list of African-American heroes. Yes, Frederick Douglass still makes the list. You can add Harriet Tubman, but included in his favorites, the conservative economist Thomas Sowell, the conservative Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, and, well, Tiger Woods. These folks, he said, quote, represent what is best in America and her citizens, unquote. And they will take their place in the president's new National Garden of American Heroes. What's that, you say? The president there's the executive order about building. This is shortly before he stepped down. Before a garden of monuments to America's greatness, and he's going to establish a task force that will explore all of this. The purpose of the executive order, he says, is to reflect the awesome splendor of our timeless exceptionalism. And this will be a testament to American greatness and goodness, and the dangerous anti-Americanism that seeks to dismantle our country's history, institutions, and various ideals that have been desecrated. He says these will be preserved for future generations. And his list includes the new list: Whitney Houston, Barbara Jordan, a Democrat; Thurgood Marshall, a progressive; Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, and Phyllis Wheatley. So, thinking about a hall of statues, a national garden of American heroes, Trump has his list, but I'm sure that many of us could come up with other lists of who should be included. So this raises the larger question of who, when considering the African American experience, who should be, can be included in that hall of statues. The U.S. Postal Service, over many decades, has immortalized a significant number of African American activists, leaders, and artists, some of which may find themselves in Trump's garden of statues, others, probably not. And historians over the years have produced a wealth of biographical studies, many of whose subjects will not find themselves in the garden of heroic statues, but one could argue should be in that garden if the statues are going to be put up. If I had to make a trade-off, say, involving the approved Booker T. Washington statue, I would easily and without hesitation swap them out for Bayard Rustin, Septima Clark, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Constance Baker Motley, and Pauli Murray, and my list could go on and on and on. And so the trade-offs: who gets to stand in the National Garden of American Heroes? And who knows if this will be built, but it's a useful device kind of for thinking about who gets remembered, who gets acknowledged, and who gets celebrated. And so Booker T. Washington was undoubtedly an important, prominent figure in African American and American history. One could argue that he was not, repeat, not a leading civil rights figure, offering as a trade-off himself the idea of political and civil rights. Those things could wait, Washington said, in exchange for jobs, economic advancement. Let us prove ourselves, work at the bottom, break strikes, demonstrate to employers our inherent value over those anarchists and radical immigrants and others who have formed unions and other organizations and who are always going out on strike. We will prove our worth. We will get our foothold. We will build an economic foundation. And someday, at some point in time, we will acquire those rights. Well, that does not qualify him, in my humble view, for inclusion in a National Garden of American Heroes. W.E.B. Du Bois was a fierce critic of Booker T. Washington, and many an academic and activists are familiar with Du Bois and his contributions. He was a founder of the NAACP. He was an editor of its monthly journal, The Crisis, for many, many years. He was a powerful voice, a very idiosyncratic voice on behalf of civil rights for the first half of the 20th century. I'm going to guess he doesn't get a statue. He gets a postage stamp years ago, but he won't get a statue. Turns out he ended his life as a communist. He joined with the Communist Party of the United States before voluntarily exiling himself to Africa. Or there's Ida B. Wells, another contemporary of Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, who was an African-American woman journalist who fiercely denounced the phenomenon of lynching and became a prominent anti-lynching and women's rights activist in the early 20th century. I think I would include her in my statues in my imaginary historical garden. I would also put in a man that I am guessing no one has heard of, or very, very few people have heard of, Isaac Myers, born a free man of color in Baltimore. He helped to organize African-American ship caulkers who were being attacked by white ship caulkers in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, helped to found the Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company to provide employment for Black caulkers, formed the National Colored Labor Union in the late 1860s to represent African-American workers before the nation, arguing that American citizenship would be a failure if Black workers were excluded from the workshops of the country. I would include Ella Baker in my list of heroes. Ella Baker, who was a longtime field secretary for the NAACP in the 1940s, dangerously traveling throughout the American South, working to organize new chapters of the NAACP. She later worked with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also helping to organize, and she was the founding spirit behind the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960, insisting to the young activists that they not subordinate themselves or make themselves a junior chapter to already existing organizations, that they maintain their independence and their autonomy. Or I would put on my Hall of Statues Pauli Murray, an incredibly fascinating activist who moved to Harlem from North Carolina in the 1930s, was a member of a small leftist organization. She gets to work with the Socialist Party's Worker Defense League, works to defend the condemned sharecropper Odell Waller on trial for his life. She travels the country, makes an impression. She works on the March on Washington movement in the early 1940s. She later coins the phrase Jane Crow to analogize the experience of women to that of African Americans, the multiple oppression that Black women face that could not just be reduced to, say, their racial position, but their gender was central as well. She eventually becomes an Episcopal minister. There is a figure who may or may not be on the larger Trump list, Rosa Parks, who gets her postage stamp, as I mentioned. She is remembered as that tired seamstress who didn't give up her seat and hence launched spontaneously a movement for civil rights in Montgomery, Alabama. But what's generally not recognized by many people who invoke her name is that she was a longtime activist. She was a part of the NAACP. She traveled the state of Alabama investigating cases of discrimination, racial and sexual violence. And you can track her life throughout the press that is now digitally available. She is an experienced hand when it comes to politics in these years. She's simply not that tired activist, and that larger story deserves to be told. I might put in my garden of statues E.D. Nixon, largely forgotten in many a civil rights history. E.D. Nixon worked with Rosa Parks in Montgomery. He was the head of the local chapter of the NAACP. He was the head of the local chapter of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And when Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat, and when she was arrested, it was E.D. Nixon that worked with women activists in Montgomery to assemble this new movement, to get Martin Luther King Jr., the new kid in town, to join and to lead that movement. Or Anna Arnold Hedgeman, a African-American activist who made her way to New York in the 1930s and 1940s, was a central force in the March on Washington movement, in the campaign for fair employment in the years to come. You can jump to the 1960s. Fannie Lou Hamer, a Mississippi sharecropper who heeded the call when SNCC activists came to town seeking to register people to vote. She signed on. She, at great risk to herself and to her family, worked to register African Americans in Mississippi to vote, for which she was arrested, incarcerated, beaten, subjected to tremendous abuse. And when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, with which she worked and was a delegate, arrived in Atlantic City for the Democratic National Convention in August of 1964, she upstaged the President of the United States. And she testified before the Credentials Committee, telling of her ordeal back in Mississippi, explaining to the nation, this is televised and is serious business, what the all-white Democratic Party allowed to happen in her state. And we can say that the President of the United States, who very much wanted this convention to be his coronation, was none too pleased. He even called an impromptu and pointless press conference to get the cameras off of Fannie Lou Hamer onto himself, even though he really had nothing to say. Willard Townsend is a name that might be remembered by a small number of labor activists today, but Willard Townsend emerged in the second half of the 1930s as the chief organizer of the International Brotherhood of Redcaps. When I was getting started in this business of history and well, not started, when I was writing a second book that was about employment discrimination in the railroad industry, I stumbled across a magazine called Bags and Baggage at the Department of Labor Library. And I have to say, I didn't know what redcaps were back around 1990. I had come of age when rail travel was long past its golden age, and the number of redcaps had dwindled to almost nothing. But in the 30s and 1940s, major rail stations could have hundreds of African-American men available to carry passengers' bags to and from the trains through the stations. Willard Townsend became an organizer. He succeeded in getting the Red Caps on the map. He eventually left the AFL for the CIO and became one of the CIO's top African-American officials, pushing the issue of civil rights in the labor movement. Teamsters might know this individual, Ernest Calloway, who was for many years a Teamsters union official based in St. Louis. We recently had Robert Bussell present in this format for the Human Rights and Diversity Commission on his book, Fighting for Total Person Unionism. I encountered Ernest Calloway years earlier when I was working on Red Caps and my second monograph, and stumbled across him as both a Black journalist isn't quite the right word, but he would write for African-American periodicals about labor issues. And then he became the publicity director for the Red Caps Union. And he wrote extensively then and in subsequent years. And so he was central to my story as someone who could explain the Red Caps situation to much larger audiences in the United States. But in later years, I came across him again when he took a bold stand in 1941 against Jim Crow in the U.S. military. In an early 1941, he notifies the federal government that he would not register with Selective Service. My conscience, he said, he's telling government officials, he's not hiding this, he's just putting out there publicly, stands offended by the specific violations of the moral laws in the form of organized ignorance, segregation, prejudice, and degradation. How can I, in true recognition of my duty to my conscience and to my ideals, respect the claims of a state, that is the U.S. government, that forces me and my people into a mode of living that is not in keeping with the promises of democracy and that disregards the high moral concept upon which constitutional government is established. If the state wishes to preserve democracy and morality in the world, he wrote, it should begin at home. So this I find to be a tremendously moving statement on Calloway's part. It turns out he gets away with his protest. I don't think he expects to, but he gets away with it. His draft board was not impressed by his refusal to serve, but the government did nothing, waiting some 18 months before it made his case go away by declaring him 4F, medically unfit because apparently he had an elbow problem. Others were less fortunate and found themselves imprisoned for their principled stance against a Jim Crow army. Calloway would be one of the people that I would include in my garden of statues, but I suspect he might not make it. John Lewis is a name that people might recognize as a congressman from Georgia who served for many years and recently passed away. But John Lewis was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In the early 1960s, he was arrested on many, many occasions. He delivered the fieriest speech at the March on Washington in August of 1963, a speech that was sufficiently controversial and almost prompted the Archbishop of Washington to leave, to walk, because the Archbishop found it too incendiary. Or what about Gloria Richardson from Cambridge, Maryland? Comes from a family in Cambridge who led a local civil rights movement in that city. She was a fiery speaker, brooked few compromises, found herself in hot water on frequent occasions. There is a mural of Gloria Richardson in Cambridge on the side of a building that I found a few years ago to stop to take pictures and talk to people in front of it. They had no idea who she was there or why this guy had pulled the car over to take photographs of her. But when I teach civil rights classes, I make a point of having some reading in the small literature that deals with Gloria Richardson. in that class. Let me say a few more words than I have about others, about the man that is on this slide here, who I have been studying for decades now, and have been writing his biography for a very, very long time. A. Philip Randolph, who may or may not make his way into the statue of heroes, but would be one of my top choices. He at least gets a statue in Boston's Back Bay Station and in Union Station here in Washington, D.C. So there are two statues of Randolph. So even if he doesn't make it into the garden, you can see him in Boston and the nation's capital. Randolph was I would argue, an incredibly important figure in the history of civil rights in the 20th century. He is not a household name today, but in the mid-20th century, he was a household name, at least in African-American households across the country. He had a long life. He lived until 1979 when he passed at the age of 90. The slide here just captures in brief a number of campaigns that he was a part of. He was born in Jacksonville, Florida, where he grew up, the son of an AME minister, excelled in school, took his education serious, and joined the early Great Migration out of the South, making his way to New York City. In the early teens, where he immersed himself in the world of radical politics, took up residence at the New York Public Library, where he studied, on a regular basis. He joined the American Socialist Party, one of the few Black Americans to do so at the time. He founded a very important and fascinating iconoclastic magazine called The Messenger that fused racial issues with class issues and called upon Black and white workers to unite, excoriated the American Federation of Labor for its racial practices, and celebrated the industrial workers of the world for their interracialism. In the mid-1920s, Randolph got a new job as head of a union, really a handful of individuals, of Pullman porters who worked for the Pullman Company, riding on Pullman Palace cars, attending to the whims of white passengers across the country. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, born in 1925, sought to organize the employees of a company that was the largest single employer of Black Americans in the United States at the time, leading to some criticism in the Black press about biting the hand that feeds them. If nothing else, at least Pullman gave Black Americans jobs in significant numbers. Randolph put his magazine, The Messenger, at the disposal of the Porters' cause, authored numerous articles establishing the need for a trade union for Black representation, criticizing the company union, criticizing working conditions, scathingly criticizing the subordination that the Pullman Company required of its African-American employees. And it was an uphill battle. And from 1925 to 1935, Randolph and the Porters battled the company, sometimes successfully, often not. But in 1935, they succeeded in winning a union election. And in 1937, they succeeded in winning their first union contract. And as the author of a piece in the Saturday Evening Post noted in 1938, this achievement, the union election and the signing of the contract, easily outranks anything that up to now the Negro on his own has accomplished in the field of labor organization. The entire Northern Negro community was stirred by it. Randolph is currently the ranking hero of the race, and his journeys are in the nature of triumphal tours. And I will just say there is a lot more to the Randolph biography that I cannot get into today, but telling his story is something that I have been doing for a long time and will continue to write for some time to come. But I will say that Randolph's career extends into the 1960s when he is one of the lead organizers for the March on Washington in 1963. And he is prominently on that podium where he announces that we are the advance guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom, and makes the case that civil rights and economic rights are inextricably linked, and that African American advancement has to proceed on both fronts. A lot more to the story. That's for another day. And finally, I will mention someone who we talked about just about a year ago, and that is Bayard Rustin. In February of last year, the commission did a session on the Netflix biopic, Rustin, with, I think, the magnificent performance of Coleman Domingo, and featuring Rochelle Horowitz, one of the organizers of the March on Washington. She was the transportation director there. If you haven't seen the biopic, I highly recommend it. I would also recommend an absolutely terrific documentary that precedes and is somewhat historically more comprehensive and accurate than the biopic, though I like the biopic too. Brother Outsider, The Life of Bayard Rustin. Rustin was a figure who is also one of those people that many Americans have not heard of, but he was in the right place at the right time, or put himself in the right place at the right time. On many occasions, he was described as the man behind the March on Washington. He was the guy who actually executed the detail. He's been described as a man who left a giant footnote. Bayard Rustin, forgotten hero. That on the 50th anniversary of the March. But in earlier years, he was working with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the Congress of Racial Equality. He was a proponent of nonviolence. He gave workshops across the country spreading the pacifist gospel. He, like Ernest Calloway, refused to serve in a Jim Crow army, or just refused to serve in the military because he was a pacifist, and he had a 3-year prison term and served time in federal penitentiary for his political and religious principles. Upon his release, he engaged in widespread protests, not just lecturing, but sitting in at diners, protesting discrimination in hotels, and telling his story anywhere he could go. For participating in the first freedom ride, the journey of reconciliation to desegregate, they were unsuccessful, Southern transportation in the late 1940s, he spent time on a chain gang. And he was also quite instrumental in the campaign to help desegregate the armed forces in 1948, working with A. Philip Randolph. I have my eye on the clock, and there is much more that can be said about Bayard Rustin's life, but there is a recording of that session and of Rachel Horowitz's very eloquent recollections and analysis of both Rustin and that period of time that is available online, that I would recommend to you. I would just say in closing that I have scratched the surface of a subject about which I could take up the rest of your evening, but I promise I won't. There is a lot out there for folks, young folks, not so young folks, who want to learn more about civil rights. A starting point might be the outstanding Eyes on the Prize documentary series that came out in the 1980s. It is still an outstanding and terrific resource. When I was in graduate school and in my early academic career, these were standard viewing in many a American history and civil rights African American history class. Since that time, the number of documentaries that are available for people to watch and to educate themselves with has expanded dramatically. The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow is a wonderful 4 episodes history that explores the broader context of segregation and disfranchisement and struggles against it. Freedom Summer, Mississippi 1964, elaborates on Fannie Lou Hamer and the struggle of her colleagues to take down the Mississippi Democratic Party. Ralph Bunche, who I have not mentioned, initially an academic slash activist who became a leading American diplomat, also has his documentary. And for those who have not seen At the River I Stand, I highly recommend this documentary that deals with the Memphis, Tennessee sanitation workers strike of 1968, where Martin Luther King lost his life when he was there in solidarity with those strikers. And in conclusion, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't recommend once again watching tomorrow night's episode. And PBS repeats things a lot. And if you have PBS Passport, you can tune in and watch it at various points. The American Experience, Forgotten Hero, Walter White, and the NAACP. But if you watch this, I ask that you keep in mind other forgotten heroes and wonder about the how and the why that this very rich history is so little known by so many people. And to keep in mind that in this particular political moment, history is a precarious thing. And what we are allowed to teach seems to be in jeopardy. What students are allowed to learn is definitely in jeopardy, and that we will be fighting over these things. The right to tell these stories, the right for students to learn this broader history. This is not to say that all historians are correct and that everything that we say is absolutely on target. There's room for debate, and that's what historians do. But this rich history deserves to be encountered. Students and others deserve to be exposed to it. And I hope that the current assault against it is a limited one and is an unsuccessful one, because we will all wind up paying a serious price, I believe, if we don't succeed. On that note, let me stop the share and see what comments or questions you might all have.
Comment. How are we doing, everyone? My name is Anthony Rosa, the Director of Human Rights and Diversity Commission for the International. It's always a pleasure to have you on, Eric. It's always a pleasure to do side by side with Karen. We've been doing this for a long time, and I appreciate both of you for all you do, and especially working beside my co-partner there, Ruben Torres. I thank you for bringing back, and the heading of this class, I think, is beautiful. I think you couldn't have picked a better heading for that. And I'm glad that you brought this up. It breaks my heart because at the end of the day, when I have my great-grandchildren, I'm worried that will there be books with history in the schools for them to learn the history of our people, and it's sad. It's sad that, last night I was watching a film yesterday on TV, and it was the March to Selma. And at the end of the movie, I was thinking to myself, I said, oh my God, Dr. King must be rolling in his grave that we're going backwards instead of going forwards. And, and it's sad that, these young kids go to school and they're removing our history and they're replacing it with other things. So I want to just say thank you. Thank you. And it's just so sad every day that I wake up and it's another stone thrown at us, and history. They want to talk about George Washington, but they don't want to talk about all these great leaders of color that done so much for the movement. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, this is Ruben Torres. I'm the Assistant Director for the Human Rights and Diversity Commission. Again, I'd like to reiterate my thanks for this program. My question to you, Mr. Arnesen, is Walter White. It's my understanding that he had an affiliation with the KKK and tried to infiltrate the KKK at one point, just to get an insight on their thinking and the lynchings and their mentality. Is that spoken about, or do you have any insight on that chapter of his life and investigation and his activism?
I am sure this will be covered in the documentary that premieres tomorrow night that none of us have seen because it's not out yet. His activism in the anti-lynching crusade in the early years is covered in a number of biographies. And the story generally is he's a very light-skinned African-American who can pass for white. And that allows him to travel in the South unmolested, and it allows him to have conversations with Klansmen, with those who are present at lynching, to get information. So that's a form of infiltration. They don't know they're talking to a Black man who does not sympathize with their brutal agenda, but he's there as a researcher. And he goes back and he writes articles about what he finds. And he shares this with the readers of the crisis. He publishes a book about what he learns and continues to be involved in the NAACP's campaign, legislative campaign, which is really not successful. But from the 1920s into the 30s into the early 1940s, this is a major cause for both him and the NAA, but because he can pass, and he does so strategically as a agent of the NAACP, this allows him to move into areas that he might not otherwise be possible to move in, and to get information that people would not otherwise be willing to share. So this proved to be a serious advantage when it came to either infiltrating, overhearing, or getting people to say things that they would not otherwise have said to him.
Thank you.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, Eric, what about some of the civil rights leaders who were kind of in opposition to King, like Stokely Carmichael and some of those folks? Where did they fit into this whole picture?
I can tell you Stokely is not getting a statue in President Trump's Garden of Statues.
Yeah,
That is not happening. So Stokely Carmichael is a member of SNCC in the early 1960s. For Carmichael and some of the others who are on the front line of organizing in the Deep South, nonviolence is a strategy. It is not a way of life. It is something that SNCC does, and so they will go along with it, but they don't believe in their heart in the transformative power of nonviolence in the way that Dr. King does, in the way that a John Lewis does, in the way that the activists from Nashville do. So they go along, but there's a frustration level. It rises. And by 1965, 1966, Carmichael has had it, as have many other SNCC activists who find King too celebrity-like. He'll fly in, fly out. Granted, he's flying across the country, raising vast sums of money for the civil rights movement. And without that money, they would be hard-pressed to do what they were doing. But they resent King for his celebrity status, for his commitment to civil rights. And Carmichael unleashes in 1966. He's become head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He ousts John Lewis in a strange election and begins to chant the phrase Black Power at the Meredith March in the summer of 1966, much to King's chagrin. And they are at ideological loggerheads, and the proponents of Black Power go off in a different direction. Many historians, use the phrase the Black Freedom Movement to encompass both the civil rights movement and its nonviolent components and aspects, as well as the Black Power movement, which rejects nonviolence and offers a very different philosophy there. I think that's a useful way of framing it, the Black Freedom Movement. But I would put Carmichael, SNCC in the latter part of the 1960s, the Black Panther Party, outside of the boundaries. Not all historians would do this, but I would put them outside of the boundaries of the civil rights movement and put them into a Black Power framework that is distinct from. But they were both sides were sharply critical of each other, though King tried to build bridges and maintain bridges and to work with those who did not agree with him. Other civil rights leaders, the top folks, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, A. Philip Randolph, and even Bayard Rustin were very, very critical of the Black Power advocates and very critical of even the phrase Black Power as one that burned bridges and didn't create them. But there was a wide range of views in the latter half of the 1960s. And when I teach this period, just like the period that I was covering here tonight, I like the plural, movements. There is no single civil rights movement that embraces the tactics, strategies, and philosophies of the many different organizations that traditionally fall under the rubric of civil rights. But it's a really rich and fascinating story.
Anyone else with some questions?
Yeah, quick question. So all these people that were part of the movement, the government, the government would the FBI would investigate a lot of these people. They would consider them socialists. What is your take on that?
They considered them radicals. So for much of its history, the FBI didn't offer the sharpest analysis, to put it mildly, of the people it was surveilling. It didn't always understand what it was looking at. The upside is, for historians, there's a paper trail that we can follow. Agents are at places that we aren't. Sometimes their information is valuable. Oftentimes it's like, oh, you have no idea what you're listening to or what you're hearing here. It's just not clear. But someone like A. Philip Randolph is a socialist. He is under surveillance. He has a nice, thick FBI file. Bayard Rustin has gone through radical circles. He was briefly in the Young Communists League, exited it and was an anti-communist. The FBI couldn't get it through its collective head that being an ex-communist is very different than being a communist or being an anti-communist. You gain certain insights from having been in the Communist Party. So there is surveillance. Martin Luther King Jr. is surveilled up and down. They wiretap him, they intercept his mail, they threaten him anonymously. The Black Panther Party is not just surveilled, it is infiltrated. And the government repression is quite severe. But by the latter part of the 1960s, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI leadership is convinced that both the civil rights leadership and the Black Power leadership, are threatening to destabilize and topple the United States government. And they step in and illegally take all sorts of action to discredit them, destabilize them, and to stop them from any success that they might have. So the story of repression is a long one. It is a sordid one, and it's a powerful one. Though in some cases, it didn't have that much effect. Randolph is surveilled. He still gets a Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. It doesn't seem to bother him much. It doesn't seem to affect him. The Black Panther Party, on the other hand, the consequences can be devastating. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just two quick things. So I was talking to someone the other day, and an older person, and they said, you know, I recall my father going upstate and meeting with these elite people. And I was like, huh? And she was like, yeah, there was these special kind of like dinners and then I go back and I said, was that part of like the Socialist Party? And she was like, yeah, we didn't really call it that. That was one thing that I found kind of peculiar when I was speaking to someone, that she was telling me that her father would go to these meetings. The other thing that I'm kind of, it's kind of sad is that what leaders do we have that are going to carry the torch of all these great people that you have mentioned that are no longer here? We've lost so many leaders, and we don't have anybody, that's going to carry it. What is your take on that? I don't really see anyone that is carrying the torch, because we're going backwards. We're not going forward. Regardless of what color you are, we are going backwards. That's my take on things.
This is a subject I think everyone could have a perspective on. So I will just briefly say, I agree with you. I think right now we're at perhaps a tipping point, but definitely things are going backwards. So we're in full agreement. I think there are lots of leaders at the local level that don't necessarily make it into the national press or to the national coverage. And there is a generation of African-American political leaders that was unthinkable in 1960 or even 1965. But the passage of the Voting Rights Act transformed the electoral face of the country. And there are now, hundreds of candidates of color running for office, winning elections in various places, who are attempting in their own way to hold on to what we have and to prevent further losses. At the current moment, it doesn't look like they're going to be necessarily successful, given the configuration of Congress and the behavior of one of the political parties in Congress that is marching in lockstep with the administration. But there are new generations of political activists and political leaders out there. They just don't look the same as they did half a century or more ago.
Can I speak for a second? Yeah, I thought there was one other person who should be considered for a statue if you're looking at statues of heroes. And I think it would be a Chicagoan, Jesse Owens, who everyone knows what Jesse Owens did at the 1936 Olympics and what a hero he was there. But not everyone knows what he did after that. And one of the things that he did, Teamsters Local 777 had a huge uproar and a raid with another union. And the big fight was the rights of the black cab drivers, taxi cab drivers. Taxi cab drivers in Chicago were not allowed to go past the state of Madison. And there was a big fight over that. And Jesse Owens came to speak at our union hall with Jim Hoffa Sr., and he spoke out on this, and it was the first time ever that a black athlete ever spoke out on the civil rights movement. He had a ton of sponsors before that. All his sponsors left him, and he lost a ton of money because of speaking out on that issue he did for free. I think he should be a hero, and I think he's one of the guys who I think's a hero in the civil rights movement that people don't always know the whole story on.
Excellent point. As you were speaking, I very quickly looked him up. Guess what? He's on the list. He's preceded by Annie Oakley. He's followed by Rosa Parks and George S. Patton. But at least according to the list that I'm looking at from the Hill website, he's going to make it into the garden.
Very good.
Let me just ask you, one of my favorite people, and I know she's not technically civil rights, but Shirley Chisholm certainly, changed the face of American politics, I think, in her own way. And, I wish more people knew about her. And I'm always pushing the documentary that was done called Shirley Chisholm Unbought and Unbossed as something to really watch and get a good feel for what she was trying to do in the 1972 election.
Thank you. She is not on the list as far as I can tell. The only Shirley there is Shirley Temple.
Oh, geez.
Just
Well,
saying.
Shirley Chisholm had a saying that I really like and I use, and that is, if they don't let you sit at the table, bring a folding chair. Which, I think is a very good point. And I think oftentimes that's exactly what Teamsters do. We bring a folding chair and make sure that we're included.
Here, here. As you can see in the chat, if you've got other additional questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. My email address is there, Arnesen, my last name, @gwu.edu. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Well, thanks everybody for coming and joining us. It was a very thought-provoking talk, and I hope all of you will watch the program on Walter White, whether you watch it tomorrow or through PBS Passport, and also be thinking about other folks that might be worthwhile to take a look at in this forum. So with that, I will say good night to everybody, and thanks for coming.